Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back to my channel. Hopefully you've watched some of my prior videos on teaching reading with phonics, on not teaching sight words, and on the importance of reading more complicated texts. In those videos, I emphasized that phonics was the way to teach reading. However, I want to take a minute in this video and make sure that we come to terms. When I say that phonics is the way to teach reading, what I mean is it's the way to teach students to be able to recognize and to call words, even words that they don't know, okay? So a lot of you may call that decoding, and you may have a broader meaning for the word reading. And I really have that broader meaning for the word reading as well, and I want to talk a little bit about that. There's definitely more to reading than calling words. Ultimately, I want my students to comprehend what they're reading. And I addressed that briefly in my video on reading versus understanding. In that video, I quoted one of my favorite authors, John Taylor Gatto, from his Underground History of American Education. I'm going to read that quote one more time. Reading and understanding are two different things. Good reading is the fluent and effortless cracking of the symbol sound code, which puts understanding within easy reach. Understanding is the translation of that code into meaning. Now, some of you would argue with those definitions. You would say that if you're not understanding, you're not really reading. And that's not necessarily what I meant in those prior videos, but I do know that understanding is what I really want my students to get. I want them to be able to read and understand more complicated texts. And with that, I want to talk about the other key element to, I'm going to call it reading comprehension to be more clear. And that is knowledge, background knowledge. Not only do you need to be able to say the words, you need to know what the words mean. You need to know the connections and the connotations as well as the exact definitions of the words. You need to be able to make those kind of things. And one of the people who really emphasized that was a professor and author named Hirsch. He probably first came to prominence with his book Cultural Literacy in the 80s, but the book that I'm going to focus on today is another by Hirsch, which is Why Knowledge Matters. And I'm basically going to read through a lot of quotes that he gives us about what leads to a better understanding, what leads to reading comprehension. But before I do that, if the student can't read the words, and by that I mean say the words, if the student doesn't have the phonetic skills to be able to figure out what the word on the page is, the rest of this doesn't matter, okay? You have to be able to decode before you can read for comprehension. So here are some quotes from Dr. Hirsch, and I'm just going to kind of go through them one at a time and kind of share my thoughts. So I'm going to start here in Why Knowledge Matters. So, the skill of reading comprehension in any given case depends more on relevant knowledge than on formal strategies. So one of the things that Dr. Hirsch emphasizes is a lot of times in education, we try to teach students general purpose reading strategies, being able to identify a main idea or being able to get shades of meaning in words. And his argument is that you really can't do that unless you have the background knowledge to do that. So here he says, relevant knowledge is more important than formal strategies. One of the classic examples that people give is if you're reading about an unfamiliar topic, even if you're a relatively good reader and being able to read words. So say I'm an American and I'm trying to read about cricket. Cricket meaning the British sport, and I know very little about cricket. I'm probably going to be lost because I'm not going to know the terms. I'm going to make the same example, but I'm going to use baseball because you, my viewers, are probably more familiar with baseball. But if someone is reading about baseball and it's talking about the pitcher or the catcher and they don't know baseball, they don't know what that is, or a suicide squeeze or a force out. You have to know the words in order to know what it means. So in those cases, even if you can read the words, but if you don't have the relevant knowledge, you're not going to have a comprehension. You're not going to have an understanding. You've got to be able to read the words first, but the knowledge is going to be important. So here's a second quote from Dr. Hirsch. Once the coding has been mastered, Notice the coding has to be mastered first. In fluency attained, relevant knowledge becomes the chief component of reading skill. If you want to read about physics and you don't have a background in physics, you either need to start with a lower level text that is going to build you up to that, or you're going to be lost. If you just go open a book about quantum physics and you have no knowledge of quantum physics, you're not going to be able to understand, to comprehend what you read. Skip ahead here a little bit. Okay, so how do we get students better at comprehending, or how do we get ourselves better at comprehending what we read? To advance comprehension abilities, there needs to be systematic knowledge building with more whole class instruction and discussion. So I think the first part should be relatively non-controversial. The fact that we need to systematically build knowledge in students. We need to give them the knowledge that they need to have in certain fields in order to understand those fields. And we really need to give the knowledge that they need to understand society. And a lot of those are traditional texts. When we look at classic literature, Western literature, many of those texts are going to make biblical allusions. And if the students don't have any understanding of the Bible, they're going to be lost. Many of them are going to refer to Greek myths, and if they don't have any understanding of Greek mythology or Roman mythology, they're going to be lost. You have to have that kind of thing, so we need to systematically build that kind of knowledge. I'm a science teacher, and in science we need to systematically build knowledge of the terms. So if we're going to understand Newtonian mechanics, we first have to understand the definitions of motion and the examples, and then we have to work through and make sure that we understand what the terms mean, because the way I use momentum in an everyday language may not be quite the same as we use it in physics, so we have to make sure we understand our terms. Mortimer Adler, in his book, How to Read a Book, really emphasized the importance of coming to terms. And I think that if you don't have background knowledge or you don't have relevant vocabulary, you'll have a really hard time doing that. So we need to systematically teach knowledge. The other thing may be a little more controversial, though I happen to agree with Dr. Hirsch, and he says we need more whole class instruction and discussion. And I think that that's important, because as a teacher, when you're in a room with lots of other kids, you can see what they're doing, you can see what they're working, but if they don't have to formulate an opinion in real time, if they don't have to express their thoughts in a way that you can see what they're doing, you don't know if they're getting it or not. And whole class discussion is a way to see that. You can see who's following, you can see their facial expressions, but you can also ask a question to anyone at any time. And if they know that, and they know they're expected to participate in the discussion, they have to pay attention and they have to follow the discussion. Whole class of discussion is the way to get more attention to students, not less, okay? And I think that I basically stole a Dr. Hirsch quote here before I get to it, but we'll read that in a minute, okay? He goes on, after talking about whole class instruction and building knowledge, he says, the best way to ensure high reading comprehension in the long term is to ensure high oral comprehension in the earliest grades. So one of the things he really emphasizes, and that I try to do with my own children at home, is to make sure that you read to kids, that you read them stories of all different types. And as they get to where they can read themselves, have them read to you and have them read aloud. And that was another thing I talked about earlier that Marva Collins really emphasized, was having students read aloud, because you could check both their phonics and their decoding skills, but you could also check their comprehension. And doing that as a group allowed all the students to follow along and all the students to answer questions. I now want to look at another quote here from Dr. Hirsch, okay? Successful whole class instruction in which all students are deeply engaged is a way of giving more attention to each child. Like I said, I stole his quote earlier. I'm basically paraphrasing, because I agree with that so much it's become internalized. So a lot of people like to denounce teachers who act in the front of the classroom and get the class to work together as a class. They might say they're trying to be a sage on the stage and they need to be a guide on the side. And I think for the most part that's nonsense. Sometimes that's true. You know, there are independent projects and students need those independent projects at times, but they also really, really, really need that whole class instruction. And that whole class instruction is guided by the teacher. It doesn't have to be a lecture, it can be a lecture. It could be an actual discussion, which is a higher level of learning. And I think especially in high schools and middle schools, I think that's an important thing. So another quote here from Dr. Hirsch. And I think this one shouldn't be controversial either, but it really makes his point about knowledge is key to understanding. An expert reader is a person who has become knowledgeable about many different topics, and for that reason chiefly can navigate texts on those related topics. So what he's saying is if you have a good general education with a knowledge of science, a knowledge of life, a knowledge of sports, a knowledge of literature, a knowledge of the Bible, a knowledge of myths, a knowledge of all of these things, then you can read lots of different texts and you can understand them. If you're missing any of those things, if you're missing any of those big areas, it limits what you can read successfully. And he emphasizes that here with this quote: when a topic is familiar, poor readers become good readers. So I talked earlier about the baseball example, and there was a study done, which he references in a different part of the book. But basically, they took kids that scored high on a reading test and had them read about baseball, but the kids didn't know about baseball, and they did poorly on a quiz on this section. And they took kids that knew about baseball, but were scored as lower readers, and they did good on this section. And so what that was showing was that, yes, decoding and those things are important, but really for a lot of things, for technical subjects, whether it's a technical subject like a sport or about science, the knowledge, the background knowledge, the relevant knowledge is as important, if not more important, than the decoding skills. Two more quotes and then I'll move away and give you my own closing thoughts. So, content delay in the early years is harmful to all. And so this is really his way of attacking what we call stage theory. And he doesn't completely dismiss stage theory, but all too often stage theory is used to say students aren't ready for this topic yet. And what they really mean is they don't have the relevant background knowledge. If you build that relevant background knowledge, they will reach that stage of learning earlier. Now there may be some limitations to that, but generally I believe that is true. And I think that too often we coddle students with baby books, which are not only boring, but not helpful in developing their later understanding. And they'd be better off reading deeper things or listening to deeper things in those earlier grades. Grimm's fairy tales are great. Aesop's fables are great. They teach morals, they teach vocabulary, they teach ideas. And then finally, my last quote here from Dr. Hirsch. The best way to learn lots of words is to systematically and coherently learn lots of things. So now I want to sum up basically his argument at once. And that is that reading comprehension depends as much on knowledge of vocabulary, as well as knowledge of things and activities as anything else. And when you combine that with teaching decoding by phonics, you really have what has come to be called the science of reading, which they've really just rebranded that in order to sell something that people who had been paying attention already knew. If you want students to learn to read and to be able to read at a high level, they need to be able to decode those words. The way to teach decoding those words is to teach them phonetically. That is the way to teach what I call reading in the true sense. But if you want them to understand what they read, you have to teach them knowledge. And if they don't have the relevant background knowledge, they'll lose it. So I think that kind of gives you the focus. I'll have another video later where I talk a little bit more about cultural references and how some of those things can be lost. But I think that Dr. Hirsch's ideas are worth looking at. And I hope that I've given you a good feel of what Dr. Hirsch had to say on reading.